Okay, so I'm going to give this another go. I just recorded it and realized that I made some mistakes, so I'll aim this with the corrections in mind. Okay, so as I pointed out, I wanted to spend some time with this by way of a screencast so as to enable you to focus on exactly what it is I'm asking for. And so this will take the time that we use for our Zoom meeting to be aimed at our um, discussions, and this will our synchronous discussion, and my podcast here will help you understand the assignment better without taking too much time out of our Zooming. Okay, so know right off the top that for the 12th of October, we will be reading Louis Poyman's In Defense of Ethical Objectivism. That's down here. Poyman, A Defense of Ethical Objectivism. For a while, I was pronouncing this Pajman, but it's Poyman. So if you ever hear me slipping into pronouncing his name, Louis Pajman, don't be surprised. I do that. I'll fall into that. Anyway, so notice too that the title is A Defense of Ethical Objectivism. So sometimes students think he's somehow defending ethical relativism. He is not. He is arguing against ethical relativism. Okay? So Poyman is arguing against ethical relativism by way of understanding the title itself. Okay? So then, before our meeting, start reading over this, and you'll be watching the screencast. So first, here's our first direction. Hypothetically tie in an ethical relativist position or ethically relativist position concerning an environmental issue. Consider how someone can be a relativist concerning the specific environmental issue selected from the options below. While you're doing that, also consider how this is connected to ethical relativism according to Louis Poyman, and then include the way in which ethical objectivity is connected or not. Okay? So what I'm pointing out there is that in order to understand ethical relativism, it must be contrasted and defined by its contrast with ethical objectivity. So just know that right off the top, okay? And so then be sure to combine Poyman's dependency thesis and his diversity thesis with your specifics on. So that means you could argue each one of these arguments. So you're going to be presenting, by the way, when you go to write, you will be presenting two arguments. One argument will be from the selection of these three subtopics: overpopulation, pollution, or energy and water use. Second argument will be on objectivity. So you have two arguments. One is a relativist argument in favor of ethical relativism, contrasting ethical objectivity. The second argument will be on ethical objectivity, countering ethical relativism. Okay, and that's what you'll be writing about, and I'll discuss that in just a second. Actually, let's go to that, because that will help us understand what we're zooming about anyway. Okay, so we're still covering, and here's in our discussion too, I have a couple of videos here to help you understand how Poyman's paper is working. Okay, so we're back here. So know too that this would all apply to how it is that we're going to be discussing. The only in other words, how we're zooming. And when we're zooming, the only difference will be that I'll assign groups: overpopulation, pollution, and energy and water use, and this objectivist argument. But when you write about it, you'll only write about two. You'll have one argument for either overpopulation, pollution, or energy water use, and one argument for ethical objectivity, two arguments all day. Okay, so I put those in red to make it a little easier to designate. And be sure that whatever argument you're using for relativism, that you're working with either this dependency thesis or this diversity thesis. So maybe I should make this into just yet another separate. Well, I think that's clear, especially now that you have the screencast. Okay, so make sure that you're referring to this dependency and diversity thesis, okay? And that's what I give you by way of explaining how this is working. So let's do this. Let's just talk about this for a second. So know that an argument is basically premises that provide a conclusion. So evidence that provide a logical conclusion could be a definition of an argument. Reasoning that supports an inference. So each premise is a point of reasoning that supports a conclusion. And so each one of the premises should be distinct somewhat to the degree that they're logically distinct, in the sense that they're not necessarily repeats of each other. Because if they're repeats of each other, then you only need one premise, and it's not really an argument because you're just arriving at a conclusion without the evidence being provided. So think of these as evident points of evidence for an argument. And know too that when you're working on this first part, that you will be getting it wrong. In other words, you are arguing from the perspective of an ethical relativist, okay? Counter to ethical objectivity, okay? So here, for example, how is the problem of overpopulation linked to a relativist position that depends? So there's our dependency or diversity thesis. That's the dependency thesis. On a society and or culture from which someone lives. Okay. Offer an example of this relativist position by way of tradition, law, or custom. Okay. Recall that China no longer has its one-child policy. Nowadays, China has a so-called two-child policy, along with a few other countries. I only cite that because oftentimes when students write about overpopulation, they want to write about the one-child policy, and China no longer has the controversial one-child policy. So know that, okay? And then you'll be writing complete sentences for the premises of that and providing a conclusion by way of a ethically relativist position, okay? So then here I actually am going to give you an example. So if you choose to write about pollution, how is the problem of pollution linked to a relativist position that relies on the diversity of the society and or culture from which someone lives? If I, as an ethical relativist, see trash all around me, it is fine to pollute, given that my pollution is my own, and not as noticeable and is different from another's carelessness, etc. Or the carelessness of companies and large corporations. Offer a formal argument which includes an ethical relativist conclusion denying ethical objectivity. And so when we look at an example here, we are then thinking one premise could be, hypothetically of course, I do not worry too much about our household energy use. Most people in my neighborhood are wasteful of energy anyway. Okay. Then premise 2, so-called objective standards of energy conservation do not always apply to everyone. Everyone's energy use is different. Okay. Then the conclusion is, I'm fine using all the energy my family needs, given that so-called objective standards of energy conservation are ethically relative, given that everyone's energy use is different. Okay, so you should start hearing something that sounds familiar, because oftentimes we use this difference argument in a number of contexts, not only in energy conservation or environmental applications, but also in just daily life. Everyone is different, so I should be allowed to do whatever I want, or have any sort of immoral behavior that I want to be excused relatively because of these so-called differences. Okay, so see that this is not a good argument. And the way we could start pulling it apart by way of a so-called bad argument is then to start looking at the premises, because now we don't have a clear connection that objective standards of energy conservation are actually don't apply simply because people are different. That's not a clear connection there, see? And so likewise, this is an ethically relativist argument, okay? And then for energy and water use, I have this working on the dependency thesis. So how is the problem of energy and water use linked to a relativist position that depends on the society and or culture from which someone lives? If everyone in my neighborhood is wasteful of energy, then it's all right to be wasteful of, and as an ethical relativist, then offer a formal argument which includes an ethical relativist conclusion by denying ethical objectivity. Okay, so you're going to be denying that if you choose that. And then here, I want you to then counter. So let's say you wrote this. Now you would counter it with an ethically objectivist claim. Okay, so maybe you could have something about energy conservation as not something that relies on difference to be valid, but rather it relies on our shared place in on the planet and in our community that is not dependent on whether or not individuals. It's not dependent on people being different. It's more dependent on people's energy use altogether. Okay, so the argument here should be an objectivist standard that is in favor of the environment, contrasting an ethically relativist position as you have here. Okay, and I think that would be relatively easy to do. And I should take this out too when I get a chance. This follow further guidelines for discussion. That's just from our study points that we'll be zooming on. And so know that this discussion here is a written assignment, and obviously you're going to be writing these incomplete sentences, okay? And use as many sentences as you want, but obviously it's going to be limited to 6 sentences all day for your 2 arguments, okay? And that's due on the 19th. Okay, so I think that's clear, and we'll take it from there. And of course, as always, let me know if you have questions. Thank you.